In December, we talked about the star that the Magi saw in the east and then saw again as they were arriving in Bethlehem. And we used computer simulation software to look at the night sky to see what it was that they saw. And we were looking at things that were going on in 3 BC and 2 BC that were pretty striking and seemed very consistent with symbolism from the Bible that would tell the Magi, who were of the tradition that Daniel ruled over when he gave prophecies about Messiah coming and when he would be killed, that it would actually communicate to them, now is the time, go to Jerusalem to look for this king who was born. So when we were visiting family over Christmas, I came across this video that was on Fox Nation called The Wise Men Who Found Christmas. And it was like a 20-minute video by this Raymond Arroyo. Raymond, you've heard of him, Leonard?
Yeah.
Because he's on there, right? He's
on there morning, noon, and night.
I'm not a Fox News junkie, but I saw that he was...
He's on the Catholic one, too.
And I thought he was a Fox journalist.
I think he is, right? So this is on Fox...
Janet, Bream, all of them.
So this is on Fox Nation, and he has a new book, a children's book, called The Wise Men Who Found Christmas. And so there was this 20-minute kind of documentary promoting the book. So this was a video that was, obviously he's pro Star of Bethlehem, right? He's not out to discredit the Bible or anything like that. And so he's interviewed about 4 different people, experts about what the Star of Bethlehem was and who the Magi were and things like that. And I was excited to watch it. I thought, oh, this is cool. We've just been talking about this. And I found it very disappointing because they seem to get just about everything wrong, I think, compared to, what we were going over. And so I have like a short clip to give you an idea of what was in the video, and then we'll kind of talk about that and identify where it is that they go astray when they come up with the conclusions that they do.
Can you order that tape?
I don't know. I think it's on Fox Nation. Like if you subscribe, it's one of those monthly streaming services. But anyhow, this is we'll just watch a couple clips.
Wrong.
Yeah, I'm not recommending this video.
Oh,
It's all wrong. I recommend my video because it's all right.
And it's great.
But we're going to look at what other people. These are not like anti-Bible people. These are people who are believing the story of the Bible, and they're looking and coming up with a different conclusion than what we came to. So we're going to look at what they say and why they're saying it.
And why they're wrong.
Yes.
oh.
So let's hear them out first.
Cambridge biblical scholar Margaret Barker specializes in ancient languages. She has her own novel take on who these Magi could be, starting with the word Magi.
Well, it's not a Hebrew word. This is one of the problems, and this is why we're not quite sure what they were. It only occurs in the New Testament account in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 2, and magus, the singular form, was used to describe a magician. There was a magus that St. Paul met on one of his missionary journeys, and he was a fairly unpleasant character. We're not really quite sure what Matthew or who Matthew had in mind when he described the Magi coming to Bethlehem. I think you have to almost ignore the name and say what group of people would be coming to look for a promised Messiah. If you start with the other information that Matthew gives us, where is he who is born King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. If you start with that, you say to yourselves, would non-Hebrew people be looking for a Messiah, and would they be coming to worship him? And then that narrows the field quite considerably.
Okay, so what do we think so far?
Wrong.
When you said wrong the first time, what was
She
it?
said Magi it only occurs in the Bible there, but that's not true. It's
Yeah.
also in Daniel, right?
Right, so she's coming at it as though the Septuagint doesn't exist. She says, well, the New Testament's written in Greek, and so there's this Greek word Magi, and the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. So who knows what a Magi is? Now we looked in the Old Testament, which had been translated into Greek 200-ish years before these events took place. And this was the popular version of the Bible that people like Matthew would have been using at the time. And Magi's in there, I think it was 8 times, all in the book of Daniel. So right off the bat, yeah, Magi.
Was the word Magi used
The same,
in Daniel?
the same
I'm
Greek,
gonna look
yeah,
it
the
up.
same Greek word.
Oh,
It's magoi in
Oh.
Greek, which is just transliterated into Magi, or wise men.
I
In-
just looked it up for you, you don't have to worry. Right there.
Yeah, eight times in Daniel, some form of that word, because Greek, like when we say of the Magi, you just spell Magi differently, but some form of that word is in there 8 times. And Daniel was in charge of them. So they would have learned from him.
they actually, what she was saying that they weren't Jews, what would they be coming to?
Well,
And I thought, wait a minute, the Lord's going to have his son revealed to more than just the Jewish.
when you start with an error,
Yeah,
then it leads to other errors. And that's really the theme that we're going to be looking at today. When
Yeah.
you start in the wrong place, if your compass is pointing in the wrong direction, it's going to lead you to the wrong destination.
She
And
has
so
a cool English accent.
that's true. And so does the next guy. But so right off the bat, she's saying, we can't know what a magi is, what a magus is, because that word is brand new. This is the first time it's used. When we look, not only did we see magi, but a synonym that was given was sophoi, which means wise men. So that's why magi sometimes is translated as wise men in some translations. The two terms are interchangeable in this context. So let's go on and...
I think they were almost certainly members of the royal priesthood. In order to explain this, we have to go back quite a long way in time. We have to go back, in fact, to the 8th century BC, when there were the beginnings of religious revolution in Judea.
Barker believed.
I can't make any sense out of what she's saying. There was no exile of priests in the 8th century. She's not talking about the Babylonian exile, because that came 100 years later. And then she goes, well, I'll let her go.
Magi.
Barker believes these Magi may have been descendants of the first temple royal priests expelled from the temple 700 years before Christ and living in Arabia.
And so the Magi almost certainly were representatives of this ancient priestly group in exile. They were the Melchizedek priests, and when they saw that the stars were right and the prophecies fitted, they came back and they found Jesus.
So the Melchizedek priests that she's talking about, Melchizedek is someone that Abraham encountered before the Levitical priesthood. There was no Melchizedek priesthood going on in the
he
8th
had no
century.
beginning and no end.
But
Melchizedek.
she just brings us in. She's using,
Yeah, I know.
if you're biblically ignorant, I guess it sounds like she knows what she's talking about. But if you understand Jewish history, you're like, she's connecting an arbitrary 8th century BC to Melchizedek, who was from like 2000 BC.
Maybe it's a bedtime story.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
She has a cool sounding clarinet in the background.
Yeah, English people sound.
Well, no, I'm saying in the background there's one of
Sounds
those
very
Arabian
mysterious.
clarinets, you know.
So she must know what she's doing.
So next, we're going to move on to Professor Sir Colin Humphreys, and he wrote a paper about the Star of Bethlehem. I went and looked it up from, I think it was 1995. And so this is, that's a long time ago now. This is coming up on 30 years. This is like his life's work, right? So let's hear what he says.
Saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Well, what was it that they saw? Theories abound. Colin Humphreys is a Cambridge physicist who has studied the Star of Bethlehem for years.
The Magi saw this star in the east of them, and then they traveled to Jerusalem, and Herod told them to go to Bethlehem because he asked his advisors where Jesus would be born. They said in the Old Testament it would be born in Bethlehem. Matthew implies they saw this star twice. When they got to Jerusalem and left for Bethlehem, Matthew says when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. And apparently the implication of Greek is when they saw the star again, they were overjoyed. And this is what a comet does. Most comets you see twice, once when they're going towards the sun and once when they're traveling away. I think there were 3 astronomical events, unusual events, which preceded the comet. And the first was what's called a triple conjunction of planets. So in 7 BC, Jupiter and Saturn came very close together in the sky and then separated, then close together, then separated, then close together, then separated. So it did it 3 times.
So what happened there is both planets went into retrograde. So they're kind of going, like this a little bit.
We talked about that.
Yeah, we talked about it with Jupiter doing that, but these happened to, they were sort of in alignment near the Earth as the Earth was passing both of them, so they both sort of turned around and went. That's what he's describing.
Oh, that's a special time.
So if you count the number of times they passed close to each other, it's 3, but it's because they kind of did this.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Now, a lot of people say that was a star of Bethlehem, but that's not correct because they never completely overlapped. They always looked as 2 separate planets. In ancient astronomy and astrology, they mapped stars in the sky onto places on Earth. So this message would be, a new king's going to be born in Israel, a very powerful message. That was in 7 BC. And then in 6 BC, the planet Mars joined Saturn and Jupiter in the sky, and all 3 were close together, but always visible distinctly as 3 planets. And so the message was, this king's going to be really special, a really mighty king.
Why is that the message? He doesn't say, but anyway.
Because Mars is the god of war or something?
I don't know. And I didn't even look at, maybe it's in his paper, I didn't look at it too far, but it was like the first woman said, and the prophecies, the time was right with the star, like she didn't cite anything. Nowhere in this entire video is Daniel mentioned or his prophecy. Now, in some of their writings, I did see reference to that, but you would think, now this I kind of have to put on Raymond Arroyo. When they allude to these prophecies, I would think the natural question is, which prophecies are those? What are you referring to? But we just sort of like take their word for it. So anyway, let's now he's at a planetarium and he's going to sort of look at a simulation of what that guy just described.
Those wise men would have to be real attentive. This is Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. I thought they'd be closer together, clustered with more brightness.
So he sounds a little unimpressed, right? This is a guy who wrote a book about the Magi, and then they tell him, here's what it was, and he goes and looks and, like, at least, before the comet shows up, he's like, these 3 planets, big deal, right? Which I do appreciate kind of his forthrightness about that. He's not like, wow, he's just like, eh.
Then in 5 BC, this comet appeared, and the message of a comet was, and we know this from an astrologer called Ptolemy, spells it out. He says, a comet in the east means a rapidly approaching event.
Wow, that's moving fast. But I guess in reality, it wouldn't have moved that fast at all. It would have just stayed in the sky.
And so the Magi then said, okay, this event, this new king is going to be born, the king of the Jews. Now's the time to jump on our horses and go to Jerusalem.
On your horses.
Well, the camel thing is, it very well could have been horses.
There is a difference.
Yeah.
But he's writing a children's book,
Yeah.
so he has to
Oh.
Well, the camels, it doesn't say in the Bible that they rode on camels. That's just a tradition. We also don't know, even in this book, there's 3. Elsewhere in the video, one of the good points, there was another guy, he was a priest named Longnecker. He actually seemed like the kind of person I could have a conversation with, and we didn't agree on all this stuff, but he seemed pretty thoughtful. He looked to the Old Testament to get clues and stuff, and he didn't come to the same conclusions, but he did point out, like, we don't know that there were 3. There could have been many more. That comes from the tradition about 3 gifts that's sort of assumed. So there's a lot of things that we kind of picture about them being on camels. We don't know,
Well,
right?
the thing of it is, camels are very rugged animals. They go through desert and everything. They don't have to have much water because that hump is, and it makes sense that they.
It could be, right? Yeah, and that's why they're usually pictured that way. But we don't know one way or the other, so that's fine. Okay, so that's.
Are they Chaldeans?
Oh, Chaldeans were not mentioned. So anyway, let's go back to the
They weren't
presentation.
Italian.
Well, the thing is, in Daniel, I mentioned the different terms being used to describe the same group of people, these advisors, like wise men, astrologers, or magi, and Chaldeans is one of them. So,
Really?
yeah, which is a region basically near the Persian Gulf. you know, so,
Oh, okay.
but yeah, Chaldeans didn't get mentioned.
So they had their Dr. Fauci's back then too.
Yeah, they're experts who, when the Medes and whether it was the Babylonians or the Medes or the Persians, it was the same group of advisors advising no matter who was ruling the area. Okay, so that compared to what we looked at, I think that there's much stronger symbolism and more striking phenomenon of one night. You know, that comet that he's describing was like a 70-day range of time that was visible.
And it's a hypothesis.
Well, it's based on some sort of vague Chinese record, right?
Okay.
Well, you said every time a comet comes,
Well, that is true.
there's a significant event.
Well, that is not
That's
true.
what he
I
said.
was saying when he said that maybe sometimes you see it coming and going, because a comet, if you remember when we looked at some of the flood stuff, they have this real elongated orbit. So when they come near the sun, you might see it.
Right,
So
but what he said in the video, Arroyo,
Yeah,
said, is
he
every
was-
time you see a comet,
yeah,
So every time you hear a bell ring, an angel gets the
Yeah.
right.
Right.
What's the difference between a comet and a shooting star?
well, a shooting star can be like a meteorite that's entering
Oh, okay.
the Earth's atmosphere.
All right.
But a comet is, when we were looking at the flood, it looks like that originated from Earth, that it was material ejected when the fountains of the deep burst forth, because they are made up of water and some methane gas, like things that are Earth-like, and you know, with their elongated orbit, it seems like that one. But that's a whole different notion. So just to briefly look at like what he was describing. So here's a shot of in February of 6 BC. This is as Mars is coming to join Saturn. Saturn's here. Jupiter, I put a tail on. I could only put a tail on one thing at a time, or else everything. So Saturn kind of followed a similar pattern as what you see for Jupiter. And now here Mars is kind of like racing in from the right to join them. So the next day Mars is going to be closer to in between. It's like going from Saturn to Jupiter.
So if all three of them.
And you can see the moon, it's a new moon, but that gives you a sense of scale of how far apart these are.
Right, but depending on what angle, you're down on Earth looking at it.
No, this is from Jerusalem or the Middle East.
Well, it's still Earth, yeah.
Yeah.
And you're looking up, and even though those planets aren't close to each other, it would appear that they're close to each other.
No, because this is
They're all in line.
picture when you look at the sky and you see the moon, right? You know how big the moon is when
Yeah.
you look at it. Look how far apart the planets are relative to the moon. That's what it would look like from Earth looking at the sky. So I put the moon is there. It's useful. They happen to be nearby to have a sense of scale of what the distance is between these stars. They're not particularly close. But Humphreys did concede. This wasn't the star of Bethlehem. This is sort of a harbinger. Kind of like we looked at the things that were going on in Regulus and Jupiter weren't the star in the east. They followed, but they kind of reinforced the message. So the comet supposedly, according to Humphrey's paper, the Chinese reference, was in Capricorn. I couldn't get it to show up in an actual simulation, that comet, but just for reference, I have Capricorn on here, just to get a little idea of like what he's saying. So this is at 4 a.m., so this is sort of late in the rising. It's pretty much in the east in March of 5 BC. Here's another shot like 10 days later. Now it's at 3 a.m., same thing. So it's kind of in the east, okay. And then 2 months later, I switched it. It looks identical. But now instead of 3 a.m., we're at 11 p.m. So Capricorn's in the same place, but earlier in the night. But this is still 11 o'clock at night, because now we're into the time where he says that they're heading to Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't say that the second star led them to Bethlehem, because if you're in Jerusalem, you just go south. But he was saying that it led them to Bethlehem. But the problem is here, when it rises at 11 p.m., it's not in the southern sky, it's southeast. Bethlehem is actually south and a little to the west. So if you go to, the same night at 3 a.m., now Capricorn is almost due south, still not at all to the west. And it's 3 a.m. Like, are they wandering around between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which is only a few miles away, in the middle of the night? Whereas the one we looked at, this star appeared at dusk. in the western sky. So you picture that they travel there during the daytime, and once they're in Bethlehem and they're looking for, where do we go, and the sun is setting, now the star appears again, and then they're astonished that they see it, because unlike this comet that would have been visible multiple nights, they had seen it for one night, and now the same super rare fusion is there again. That's why they were overjoyed when they saw it.
Isn't it something that when the Lord was working with these stars, they're only allowed so close? Because if they get too close to one another,
well, these are
knocked
technically
out of orbit.
These are planets, and they only appear to be doing these things from our vantage point. They're always far apart. It's just that from where we see them, they look like they're close, but there's distance.
Each one has its field.
Yeah. Okay, so that the whole thing begs the question: why are they looking in 5, 6, 7 BC? They never even looked or considered the time frame we were looking at, which was 2 and 3 BC. So why is that? Does anyone know? Why would Colin Humphreys be looking at star simulation and records from so far back? Lou knows.
I know, and I'm not saying.
Okay. The reason is because they know that Herod the Great died in 4 BC, or they think they know. And so what we're going to look at is, why do they think that Herod died in 4 BC, and why are they wrong? Everything that we know, apart from Matthew, about Herod the Great, pretty much comes from Flavius Josephus, who wrote in the late 1st century. He was a Jewish historian, and he wrote great Jewish history, and he dedicated quite a bit of space to Herod the Great. Not so much to his successors, some, but he wrote a pretty detailed account of Herod the Great's reign. The thing is, though, about his writings is he's not using our calendar, right? In the 1st century, they weren't calling things 4 BC or 1 BC or anything like that, right? He's referring to older dates, so they have to be interpreted. It's sort of like a Sudoku puzzle, where you have a few known reference points, and then you have to build off of those, because there's some historical events that we can cross-check with other sources, or even himself in other places, that are kind of like anchors, and then you have to build off of that. But the question is how. So William Whiston translated the works of Josephus into English in 1737, and he also added lots of footnotes. So you get not only the English translation, but you also get, in a lot of cases, his interpretation of what he's translated, which is often useful, but if he gets something wrong, it's real easy to get the wrong idea planted in your head. And then there's Emil Schur, who was a German historian who wrote in the late 1800s. And Whiston and Schur both dated Herod's death in 4 BC.
Is this the same Herod that ordered
killing
of
right,
the kids?
Right.
He was a butcher.
The one. So apart from Matthew, everything else comes from Josephus. So we have this reference that says that Herod was alive when the wise men visited. But if you go in thinking that Herod's dead before 3 BC, you're going to be looking in the wrong years.
Okay.
So that's how they get pointed in the wrong direction. Now, if you're the type of person who doesn't like the Bible and you want to discredit the Bible, you love the idea that Herod died in 4 BC because it creates all kinds of problems. But unfortunately, it gets stated so much, and it's usually cited, if there is a footnote, it'll say, sure. It'll be like, Herod died in 4 BC, or his successors began their reigns in 4 BC. And so that gets repeated over and over again. And if there is a footnote, it's usually pointing to Schur. So that becomes an argument from authority, because when Schur wrote, as a historian, basically what he is doing is giving a retelling of what Josephus wrote and kind of baking in his interpretation of the timeline with modern dates, right? But he doesn't show his work. It's not an academic paper that he's writing where he's trying to provide evidence. He's just matter-of-factly stating,
He's a commentary.
Herod died in 4 BC, and he's an expert, so we're supposed to trust him.
Commentator.
Whiston, similarly, kind of does the same thing. He makes some claims that sound very assertive, but we don't know how he arrived at that conclusion. But everyone
started back then, right?
that's what I'm saying. I'm saying so. if Whiston interpreted it wrong and got 4 BC, if Schur got it wrong, then since then, everyone else can say, Herod died in 4 BC, fact, because here's a footnote. It points to Schur. And it's an argument from authority, and nobody has to. So if you want to say that Herod didn't die in 4 BC, you have to do all this legwork, or you can just say Herod died in 4 BC because,
So-and-so said.
yeah, you cite your source and you're done, right?
Yeah.
On your calendars, Jewish calendar was before our calendar.
Right. Yeah, but you have to figure out using their calendar and convert it to ours, and that's complicated.
We
And that's
haven't
where
we haven't had our calendar for what, 200 or 300 years?
Oh, wow.
So
You know about AD?
Yeah, I'm talking about the calendar that we use.
our Gregorian calendar,
Yeah.
1582.
Yeah.
Before that, it was a Julian calendar, but that was only off by as much as 10 days. So it's pretty close, especially when you get back to ancient times. They're basically the same. But Josephus wrote there was no AD or BC when he wrote. So he was referring to Roman Olympiads, which were windows of 4 years. And he was referring to the the 15th year of Herod's reign. And then you have to go, what is he using for his starting point, and how is he counting from that?
Wow.
Okay, so before these guys, for over 1,000 years, sort of the general, like now people say Herod died in 4 BC. Well, it used to be that Herod died in 1 BC. That was the traditional view from historians and everything, basically until the last 100+ years, or maybe a couple hundred years. So one of the major events that kind of anchors when Herod died is in Antiquities of the Jews. He's describing this event where there was this rebellion at the temple, where Herod had restored the temple and put a lot of money to renovate the temple. And he had put this golden eagle above the gate. And that's a graven image. So there were Jews who didn't like that was there. It was offensive to them. And there was this group of people, Matthias, another guy named Judas, and they were getting rowdy and they were being egged on. And then there was a rumor that Herod was dead. And so they tore down this eagle. Okay? And, well, Herod's not dead. And so they were rounding a bunch of them up. And so we read that Matthias, who had raised the sedition, so he was kind of like the ringleader with his companions, Herod burned them alive. Okay? That was the penalty. So that's a big thing. And he says, and that very night, there was an eclipse of the moon. Now, this is the only eclipse of the moon that in all of Josephus' writing that he mentions. But it's a major event in history, and then that night there's an eclipse. So people kind of made that connection. So he's writing several decades later. He didn't witness this firsthand, but there's some consciousness that there had been this eclipse on the night that these people were brutally executed. So here's 4 candidates that I've got on here, and I didn't put on the year yet, but you have a total eclipse that occurred in September. These are, say, in different years. You have a partial eclipse in March at 3 a.m. You have another total eclipse, like a blood moon, and then you have this one that was basically like a half eclipse that's shown there like at moonrise. So when the moon rose, it was an eclipse. So which of these 4 would you say would be the weakest to enter into the public consciousness? Any thoughts? Which one's the least likely for people to take notice of?
Probably September.
3 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah, the one that's like a weak partial eclipse at 3 a.m. when everyone's asleep. I would think that would be the one of these 4 that would be the least likely for people to take note of it and say, and that night there was an eclipse. But that is the one that in the footnote that Whiston wrote, he declares that it was that one. And he doesn't even mention any other possibilities. It's just stated as a cold, hard fact.
Who are these people that are up at 3 in the morning?
Shepherds.
But that's the thing. I think they're not even looking at the right eclipse. Even if they did see it, it was you might barely notice. It's not like it got darker, because this is a full moon. If you have a total eclipse, it's noticeably darker, and that would last longer than this little weak partial eclipse. But he just states matter-of-factly that this happened in 4 BC. So it happened 1 month before Passover in 4 BC. And so that is also mentioned related to Herod's death. So we're going to look now between the events of the eclipse and Herod's death, the stuff that happened, okay? So I should say also, I forgot to mention, actually, Whiston thinks that this, between the eclipse and the Passover, was 13 months. Like, he thinks it's the Passover the next year, but Sure seems to allude, he doesn't mention the eclipse, but he seems to think it's 1 month. And we'll look at why the distinction. So here's the events that happened following that eclipse. So Herod, he had a really gross set of symptoms that were very painful, and I won't get into them. But he got a lot worse. So right after this eclipse, we're told his sickness greatly increased, inflammation and pain. So he was in Jericho at the time. Doctors told him to go to Calero, which is circled in blue there, which is about 20 miles away. There were hot springs there. There's still a resort there to this day because of these hot springs to treat it. So he went there, gave up on the treatment. So I would think he was there several days, but it didn't work. So then he came back. Then he ordered, I think Lou talked about this, he knew he was going to die and he was worried people weren't going to mourn him. So he ordered important people from every village to come so he could lock them in the hippodrome and then kill them when he died. That way, all these families would be sad about these other people. He was a nut, right? He was
nuts.
Yeah.
Narcissist, yeah.
But he had to send out the order to every village, which, maybe 80 miles.
Takes time, yeah.
He's got to send out the message. Then people have to comply with it and come to him. So that would take time too, right? Then we read that he had his son Antipater executed, and that Herod died 5 days after that.
Thank God.
Yeah, not Antipas, Antipater.
Yeah, Antipater, who was going to be his heir, but kind of at the last minute, Herod killed him and then amended his will. But we're told specifically that there was a 5-day gap between him killing Antipater, or having him killed, and dying. And then there's this grand funeral plan for him. So his body was taken from Jericho to Herodium, and I think properly interpreted, they had a 1 mile procession, basically like a parade rate, right, through Jericho, and then went at a normal speed the rest of the way. So the quote from Josephus is, so they went 8 furlongs, a furlong is 1/8 of a mile, so they went 1 mile to Herodium, for there, by his own command, he was to be buried. So Whiston, in a footnote, interprets this as they went 8 furlongs per day. So that would take like 3 weeks. Yeah. But who wants to go 1 mile and then set up camp for the night with a dead body? He doesn't say per day. So I think he went the first mile slowly as a big to-do, and then they just, between the cities, there's no reason to go so slowly. There's no one there to see it. So they just went the rest of the way. So that's why Whiston thinks that it's the following year, because there's no way you could do all this in 1 month, right? When 25 days or something like that is just a funeral procession. So that's where the distinction comes in there. But Whiston does think that Herod died in 4 BC, just later in the year. So then you had a 7-day mourning period and a funeral feast. And then the people who didn't get rounded up and killed, but escaped, they're getting all rowdy because now Herod really is dead. And they're causing trouble at the temple again. And Archelaus, who's in this region, he's to be the new king. He's irritated with them because he needs to go to Rome to affirm his kingship. And he's got these people causing trouble at the temple. And Passover's coming up. So that means a lot of people are coming out of town. And so if you have rowdy people at the temple and then a bunch of out-of-towners, things could get even more out of hand. So he's got to shut this down. So he ends up slaying 3,000 people. And that was, again, leading up to... He killed 3,000 people.
These people, did they just walk in there?
That's the family.
They were coming from the Passover.
They got passed over,
Yeah.
all right.
Think like, a big crowd. And this was going on for days because Josephus talks about how they were basically living at the temple and begging for food. And, and so Archelaus had to shut this down. It came to a head. He sent armed people and they killed a few thousand of them. But this is all leading up to that Passover. So this is, again, a lot of stuff, even if you allow for the shorter funeral procession, a lot of stuff for 1 month. Okay, so now looking at the years here, and I've already given this away, that partial eclipse is the one that Whiston says is the one that happened without even mentioning any other candidates. Now, the one in 5 BC, I think the only reason people bring that up is because they've already decided that 4 BC is when Herod died, and there was a more impressive eclipse the previous year. So, but now you have like half a year. So you don't have a lot of wiggle room once Herod is dead, because Archelaus has to go to Rome ASAP, right?
Oh, yeah.
So the only wiggle room you really have is like, how fast was Herod's decline? Did that drag on for 4 or 5 months or not? And then you have in 1 BC, 3 months before the Passover, you had a full blood moon. And the following year in 1 AD, you had this one at moonrise. So I would think either one of those two are good candidates.
Is a blood moon when you have 2 full moons in one?
No, you're thinking of a blue moon is when you have 2 full moons in 1 calendar month. The blood moon is just that it's reddish when it's an eclipse, just because of the edge of the shadow looks reddish.
Did they think that was eerie or?
Yeah, I mean, well, you have these people killed, and then that night, actually, I do think on the one hand, with it being associated with these people being killed and the blood thing, they would call it the moon turned to blood, right? That kind of points more to 1 BC, like the quality of the eclipse, but it's in January, kind of late at night. So the other one you would think would definitely be seen by a whole lot of people because it happened at moonrise when people are still up and about. So, you can't say for sure, like, this is the best eclipse, so that's when it happened. The event happened and there happened to be an eclipse. But either one of those two are good candidates. To say it was definitely this wimpy eclipse at 3 a.m. in 4 BC, there's really no reason to determine that for sure. So now we look at Josephus gives 2 Roman years as the beginning of his reign. One is in 4039, because their calendars didn't sync up with ours. So Nisan in the spring, right? That's like 4 months into our year. So if you're talking about 40 BC, but it's actually 39, like January, February, March, that's why it gets a little complicated with these. We'll look at it visually to clear it up. So when I put 40/39, that doesn't mean we don't know when it happens. That time frame spans 2 of our years. So first he was named king by Rome in the 4039 range, and then 3 years later is when he actually took power because a different group had a different guy and he was reigning, and so Herod had to go to war with him and kill him and take over. So you had like
From the house of Jannaeus.
Right, you had the legal start of his reign and then the true start of his reign. It'd be sort of like election day versus inauguration day, right? In this case, it's like, when did Rome consider him king to when he actually was in Jerusalem ruling, right? So that's the distinction.
Like King Charles, like when the Queen died, he became king, but he hasn't been
Coronated.
coronated.
Okay, so something like that, right? So you have these 2 starting points that you can say. And then when Herod died, Josephus says that he reigned 34 years since he had Antigonus, that other king, slain, or 37 years from when the Romans made him king. He says that in 2 different places, right? What he doesn't tell you is everywhere else that he says it was the whatever year of Herod's reign, he doesn't tell you what he's using for a starting point. And that's going to matter. It could be from the first one or the second one. Now, the 4 BC people, the way they count the years, and this even goes to like Whiston's footnotes, he says that they use the old, I think it's the older one. I might get it mixed up. But on the left, you have a counting of inclusive years. So the year that he became the king, even if it's a partial year, you call that 1.
Well, that's like we were talking about
Yeah.
the horse. If a horse is
Yeah.
born after the starting date, let's say January 1st, then it's called a yearling.
Yeah, so it's
Even
just
though it's not a year old.
right. Yeah, and there's times where in the Bible that kind of thing seems to be taking place. We just don't know. We're not arguing like what Josephus should have done, but we're trying to figure out what he did. And so we're going to try to look at clues from known events and try to figure out which of these timelines he's referencing. So the mainstream view is that he was using inclusive counting and counting generally from the shorter timeline, so the one that was like 37, 36. And then kind of late in the week, I found really great work of chronologies and stuff from this guy. He's French, Gerard Gerteau. And I saw both his PhD candidate paper and something that he wrote, like kind of a little shorter version of similar stuff. He is a PhD now. I came across both of them and they're excellent. I'm not saying they're flawless, but it's very good. It's the best I've seen. And I had been looking at a lot of other things and a lot of other ideas and stuff, and I think he makes particularly strong arguments. And he suggests that when Josephus refers to years of Herod's reign, that he's actually going back to the earlier date, but he's using exclusive dating. And this is sort of like pregnancy compared to a birthday. So in 40 BC, at the end of our calendar year, like in December, I think it was, the Senate decided that he would be king effective January 1st. So that's like the starting point for that timeline. But it's not year zero. It's like as if he's pregnant, right? So it takes effect on Nisan 1. That was the Jewish New Year. And so that's like the birthday, right? And so now you're not 1 year old, you're 0. So it's like when the Senate decided he's expecting the kingship, and then the following Nisan, now it takes effect, and then the following Nisan, now it goes to 1. It's a little weird because then when you say you would say the first year, and he's already been king for a year plus. Again, I'm not saying that this is like the best way he should have done it, but this is a hypothesis that maybe he's doing it that. So like I'm 45 years old, but I might say I'm in my 45th year. Now someone might go, wait a minute, it's actually your 46th year because you've already finished 45. That seems to be the hypothesis that what he's doing. Even though I'm 45, that I'm referring to this as my 45th year. That's the
In China,
Gerteau.
when you're conceived, that's when you start.
Right.
So
But that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at A and B,
isn't that
right?
what they were talking about?
We're looking at what is the mainstream view that Josephus, when he referred to a certain year of Herod's reign, that he's counting from the 37, 36 BC, and that he's counting that as his first year. That's in blue, right? So you have, this is what Whiston and Scherer are doing. They think Josephus is counting from here, and that this is year 1, okay? What this guy is saying is perhaps we should be counting actually from back here, but we wait until Nisan 1 to start year 0. And so what you have here is these numbers end up being pretty close to each other, right? Yeah. And so let's say an event takes place at the beginning of the spring in his 7th year. That could mean the end of his 7th year this way, or the beginning of the spring here. It's inconclusive, right? You can't really tell from this which of these two is right, you know? But the consequence of this is when you get to the end of his life, this is where they land at 34, 37 in 4 BC. This is the Scherer death date. This is the Whiston death date. And then with those other, so I've got the eclipse here, right? Yeah. So here's the blood moon. That would take you to here. The partial eclipse would take you to here. Are we saying this is the 37th year, or is that year completed? It could be either of these. Herod, Josephus says, was about the 70th year. If, based on other reference points we have, like what year he was 25, he was actually 70 years old here. But this says about the 70th, like that's still a little ambiguous. I don't think it completely rules this out. Now, the French guy pretty much only addresses this possibility, but I haven't 100% ruled this out either. But it doesn't matter, because we're looking at the stars and the birth being in this range. We need to get out of this, right? So either of these would work. So here's the clue that breaks the case. The Battle of Actium, so that's one of our anchor points, that took place in 31 BC. It ended in September. Josephus writes about earlier in the year in the spring, no, that's the one that's inconclusive. I'm sorry, we already covered that one. That was the 7-year one. That's referring to Actium, the Battle of Actium in the spring, and we can't tell which one it is. Okay, so this is the one that breaks the case. When Herod started that renovation project for the temple. In one place,
Is this after the eagle was?
yeah,
torn
this
down?
is before it. This is probably what ended up with the eagle there, right?
Okay.
He put a lot of
okay.
gold and built up the temple. That's a major event in his life. So Josephus says in Antiquities that this happened in the 18th year of his reign. But in his other book, The Jewish Wars, he wrote that it happened in the 15th year of his reign. And you can see in Antiquities, just before that, he says Herod had already reigned 17 years, which kind of sounds like in his 18th year, that Caesar came to Syria. And we know that that happened in 20 BC. So now you're stuck. If you're trying to use this, you can't reconcile all this because we have 18 and 15, right? Yeah, 18 and 15. But if you try to go 18 and 15 over here, first of all, they think Antiquities always uses this column. But even if he was inconsistent, let's say you go up here, you're in the wrong year because we know when this happened, and that happened down here. So either Josephus made a pretty major mistake, or we've been interpreting it wrong. And I think it's the latter. Okay, so going on to Luke, we have Augustus's census that's mentioned in Luke 2. Should we save this for next week?
Yes.
All right, this is a good transition point. So we'll end a little early so that we don't have to rush through the rest. But to give a preview,
It's a teaser.
this is controversial. Again, you have the scoffers say Quirinius wasn't governing when Herod was alive. And they say that this census, there's another census that Quirinius does like in 6 AD, and then there's a tax census that took place years earlier. And so they'll start with this assumption that Luke is mixing up a whole bunch of events. We'll get into that next week. But they're wrong, and we'll prove it.
They're wrong.
All right, thanks.